Hi. So who has actually downloaded the app? Who has like downloaded it before, but like looked at it or something? All right. Okay. All right. It's good enough. All right. You don't have to look at the app, but it like what I'm talking about might make more sense. All right. So as Georgina mentioned, we're gonna talk about data binding today. And I learned best by example and by doing stuff. So I thought I'd share how to learn data binding by working through Plaid. So Plaid is an app by Nick Butcher. He's a Google design relations engineer or something like that. But he does a lot of design stuff and animations. And basically, Plaid is a sample app that demonstrates material design concepts like animations, elevations, all the things you can do with the fab and all those kinds of things. And so it's currently written in Java. And I'm porting it to use data mining, and someone else is porting it to Kotlin, I think. So yeah, we don't want to mix porting things. All right, let's do this. So most people, when I ask if they use data binding, assume that it's just butter knife. Like it's just another dependency that I would need to add in my app, which really doesn't do anything different to butter knife. But is it really? So we're gonna go through the possible differences. So personally, I think butter knife is definitely not equal to data binding. First off, they have different approaches to find views by IDs. With data binding, you don't need IDs at all. Like you can get away with not using IDs and still interact with your views. Data binding allows you to modify your UI from models, pojos, view models, what have you. It also allows you to have mathematical and logical operations inside your XML. It has null protection affordance, so kind of Kotlin-esque. And it allows you to have imports and variables. By imports and variables, I mean you can use stuff like text utils or constants in the framework like view.gun or view.invisible. But there's a lot more differences that data binding allows you to do. So we're gonna try and go through most of these if Jason doesn't drag me from the stage. Yeah, so it's the timer. Yeah, it's that. All right, so how do we get started with using data binding? So nothing can be simpler. You just add it to your build.gradle. And if you're using Kotlin, oops. Yeah, and if you're using Kotlin, you would also need to include the data binding compiler and apply the plugin. So let's go through a quick overview of how data binding works. So as I mentioned, it works with your XML layout files. So when you do compile the app, what it does, it checks all your layout files for data binding stuff in them and then takes them out of those layout files. So it then generates a Java binding file. And with data binding, we're gonna work a lot with this binding file. And it puts in all those data binding things that it found in your XML files into that Java binding file. So if you wanna see how it looks like and like how it converts stuff from XML to the Java equivalent, you can go to your apps build/generated/source folder. There should be a data binding data binding folder there, sorry, with all the binding generated files. So how do you actually get started? If you have an existing app, the easiest way is to choose something that has pretty much static content. So for the Plaid app, I started out with the About page, which is a view pager. It has static content for the first, well, mostly for everything, I think. So for the first page, since it's a view pager, you can even break it up. Like start with the first page converted to data mining, and that's it. You're done. Like it will still work even if all the other pages are not converted. So it's pretty self-contained, which is a good starting off point. So how do we begin? You can right-click on the root layout of your root tag of your layout file. So in this case, scroll view. And then you can press Alt-Enter and choose Convert to Data Binding. And then that's it. Android Studio will convert it for you and put in all the required tags for you. So now, to use this newly converted file, so this is the existing implementation in Plaid which uses butter knife. To use our existing, our newly converted layout file, you just use the generated binding file and you inflate it, and then you have access to all the views within that file. So it's pretty similar. You actually don't need to get the text view in this case, like the description, but yeah, it's a step-by-step process. So the IDs in the generated file will match the IDs in your XML file. Actually, in Plaid, Nick has done a good job of putting IDs in, so like I don't have to do anything about that. Like I just change the inflate to the data binding file, and that's it. So a thing to remember here is that if you know only the layout file at runtime, so if it depends on some other variable, for example, the framework has a class called data binding util, and it has an inflate method in it, and it accepts an arbitrary layout file. If you are using it for, if you are using data binding for an activity, for instance, you should use data binding util.setContentView instead of the normal inflate method. All right, so some naming conventions we have to remember is that if you have an XML file that you converted to data binding, the generated Java binding file will be called the name of your XML file, in camel case, smooshed together with the word binding attached to the end. If you have an ID, say your view ID is about_description, it will smoosh the words together and then camel case them. So you can, all the links that I will show is a diff of my fork of Plaid with the original upstream version of Plaid. So it's kind of like see how things are different between data binding and like the traditional butter knife implementation. All right, so let's skip to the third part of the About page, which is a recycler view of libraries that the app uses. So it's each entry is a library. It has a title, a description, an avatar or an icon, and a link to a website. So it has a pretty rigid structure for each item in the list. So since this is a recycler view, we'll work with a view holder for each item in the list. So similar to how we did the About conversion the first time, we alt-enter on the root layout of root tag of the layout file, and then convert it to data binding. So the difference between this one and the first file that we converted is that we actually have a model of a library that we want to display in the list, right? Like your typical recycler view and view holders. So we need to make data binding understand that model or that POJO. And we do that by setting a variable in our layout file. So if you do this in your XML, data binding will automatically generate a setter in the generated binding file. So follow me. So it will generate a setter named set and then whatever the variable name is. So in this case, it's library. So we will have a set library method. All right, so this allows us to use the actual POJO or model directly into our code. So in this case, if you do library.name, you will be able to get the value of that field. So data binding understands POJOs with final fields or Java Bean style setters and getters. And for data binding, you can omit the word set or get. So if you have a method name called setName, for instance, with data binding, you can just call library.name and it will automatically match it to the method called setName. So this is the data binding syntax, as you may have noticed. So whenever you use that, it's a signal to the compiler that this is a data binding thing that you have to strip out and handle. All right, so now what about those click listeners, right? So I mentioned that the recycler view has a link to the library website. So we can do that with data binding as well. So we can pass in handlers similar to how we pass in variables, and the handlers can be anything. It can be your presenter or your view model or like whatever architecture pattern you follow. So as long as it has the implementation of what the event should do, you can pass it into data binding. So the type needs to be fully qualified, but like Android Studio supports that already. So in this case, if we want to go to the library's website, we'll hook it up to the onClick method of the button. And so what I'm showing here is the Lambda implementation of a click, well, not a click, an event listener in general. So there are a couple of ways to do event listeners, and this is the first one, the Lambda version. The thing to remember here is that the implementation of your on-library link click method must match the return type of the actual event you are listening to. So for example, if you are listening to an on-long click, it returns a Boolean, so your implementation would have to return a Boolean as well. If the event has parameters, so in this case, on click, it has one parameter in the framework implementation called view. You either have to name all of it or ignore all of it. So it's like all or nothing. So in this case, in the point of view of data binding, those two implementations are the same. We can also use method references. This is the second part, method reference. So it's the class name, colon, colon, and then the method name. Personally, I prefer to use the Lambda method because you can easily pass in parameters into your handlers instead of this one. The difference between the two is that with method references, your on-library link click implementation must match the signature of the event exactly. Like you can't omit parameters, unlike in the Lambda variation. So what's the difference between on-click with data binding and the traditional on-click in Android, right? Like you can always do this, like Shin's API, whatever. Like you can hook up an on-click listener to your view. So the difference is with data binding, everything is checked at compile time. So if there's like a invalid method reference or invalid syntax, everything is checked at compile time. So you don't have to wait until you actually run the app and crash at runtime. So this is probably my favorite part of data binding, is that it allows you to drop in custom attributes to native widgets without having to extend those. So traditionally, what we do, we make an attributes.xml file, hook it up to our views on create, read the values, and then recycle the views. Like there's so many things to remember just to have a custom attribute. But with data binding, you can just drop in your attribute and then have an implementation for it, and that's it. It will work out of the box. So in this example, I want to use Glide to load the library avatar. So then you can do whatever you want with that URL that you get. All right, so now the avatar has a characteristic, like if it's not a person, or if the branding guideline of the library does not allow it to be circle cropped, there is a field in the library Pojo that Nick created. So in this case, we want to pass in that variable as well. So we can update the binding adapter to accept these two attributes, the URL and if it needs to be cropped or not. So the important thing to remember here is that if you have multiple parameters into your binding adapter, they need to be added in order in the method implementation. So it's important. And if not all attributes are required, you can indicate that not everything is required. So one thing that people ask me about is, well, won't it inflate or like make your layouts unnecessarily complicated? So the answer to that is, if it's getting crazy, move it to a binding adapter. It's easy enough. Like just make an attribute, make a binding adapter, move everything to your code instead of in the XML file. So now, since this is data binding and a recycler view, one thing we need to remember is that if you are using data binding in a recycler view, you need to tell recycler view that there are changes to your library bindings. So call execute pending bindings is pretty important, so that changes to your view holders will be applied immediately instead of waiting for the next frame. So code again. So
when do you call the execute bindings?
In your onBind view holder, like towards the end of, like after you set the model to the view holder.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so So form validation is kind of something that a lot of people do, I think. At least I do it a lot. So data mining has a lot of affordances that makes it easy for us, and it allows us to put in a lot of niceties for users very easily. So one thing that we usually do is, so this is from like the existing code in Plaid. Like it has a text watcher for the username and password when a user types it in, and then it listens to after text changed, and then sets the button if it's enabled or disabled. So I find that this is a pattern that a lot of people use, but if you notice, we really don't care about the before text changed and on text changed, we just care about the after. But since this is Java, we have to implement everything, right? If we really don't care, even if we really don't care about all those other methods. So with data binding, we want to be able to hook it up to just the after text changed event. It is an event after all, and data binding has event listeners. But there is no Android : after text change attribute, right? Like we really don't use it. We use text watcher. So it doesn't exist, or does it not really? So one thing I find very useful while learning data binding is to look at the framework implementation of stuff. So like if you go to text view binding adapter, if you Command-Shift-O for it, this is the framework implementation, and it has a lot of examples on how to do things. So if you search for after text changed within it, there is actually an implementation for a text watcher, which is exactly what we want. Yay. So if you are at a loss on how to implement something, or if you want ideas on how to do something with data binding, I really suggest you look at the framework implementation of things like the default widgets. Yeah, so now in our XML file, we can just use Android after text changed, and then in our code, like delete everything and just have that. So which like simplifies our code a lot and like removes a lot of the boilerplate code that we really don't care about. All right, so I implemented it for all the listeners in that form, which is a lot, and this is the code where I do that. One other nice thing that we can use for forms is active listening to states. So it's sort of like an observable pattern sort of thing. So if the login credentials are available, we want the button to be enabled. So the way I approach this is I made a sort of new model for the username and password, and then data binding allows us to have two-way binding, which means that whenever something is changed in the actual view, our model changes with it too. So in this case, since it's an autocomplete text view, whatever the user types into the username field, if we access designer news credentials.username, we will get whatever is last typed into that autocomplete text view. So it's kind of getting the after text changed listener for free without doing all the kinds of things. So now we want to hook up the button, right? So any arbitrary field, such as a boolean, a byte, a short, an int, a long, event collections, they can be observable in data binding. So in this case, I want the check for the username and password presence to be automatically hooked up to the button state as well. So I opted to go with a hash credentials observable boolean, and then you set it to whatever value it currently is because of our listeners. It allows us to do that very easily. So now we can use this in code just like that, really simple. And the PR for this whole thing is that link. All right, so at this point, we've done a lot, and that's the code. And we have 30 seconds to go through some tricks that I learned while I'm using data mining. So context, whenever you want context, you don't need to import it as a variable. It's automatically there. You can use strings and string formatting and plurals and all those kinds of things. It still works. You can set default values if something defaults to null, or for example, if you want to incorporate a layout height or a layout margin or whatever to data binding, and it may or may not exist, you can have a default value as well for that.
How do you use spaces where you had your name before?
What? Where?
You have default equals Zarah. How would you do like a space if you want to put like your full name? You have to put single quotes or double quotes?
I think single. Yeah.
Okay.
And you can also extract it in an R in strings.xml, and that will work as well. So if you don't want to hard code it like that, you probably don't want to. Probably want to extract it.
Zarah's pretty good at the default.
Yeah, sure. All right. So for things that have setters in code, such as for drawer layout, if you want to set the scrim color, for instance, you have to do it in code currently. But with data binding, since there is a setter for scrim color called set scrim color, and I mentioned it looks for setters, just omit the setter word. You can use that directly. And maths, don't do this. I'm just showing you can do this, but don't do this. But you can, but don't. And conditional execution. So if something needs to happen, depending on a condition, you can use the void keyword if you don't want anything to happen. But yeah, so if else conditions is possible too. Yeah, and if you are including a layout into another layout, the way to do it with data binding is to set the variable in those two layouts, and then you can pass values around between any of the included layouts, however nested they are. Right, so I have a bunch more. I'll share the slides, and you can go look at it. Thank you.